Eric Theodore Cartman represents one of fiction's most fascinating studies in human dysfunction, a character whose very existence seems designed to illustrate how circumstances, genetics, and environment can conspire to create a profoundly troubled individual. While many view Cartman simply as an antagonist or comic relief, a deeper examination reveals something far more tragic. A child whose life circumstances have essentially doomed him to a cycle of failure, isolation, and misery that he's largely powerless to escape. From the moment we're introduced to Cartman in the pilot episode of South Park, it becomes clear that this isn't just another misbehaving child. There's something fundamentally different about how he processes the world around him, how he relates to others, and how he understands his place in society. His confidence appears unshakable, his schemes elaborate and ambitious. Yet beneath this facade lies a profound emptiness that drives increasingly desperate behavior. The tragedy of Cartman's existence isn't just that he causes harm to others. It's that he's trapped in patterns of behavior that guarantee his own suffering while simultaneously preventing him from developing the tools necessary to escape these patterns. Understanding why it sucks to be born as Eric Cartman requires examining the perfect storm of factors that created him. Unlike characters who face external obstacles but possess internal resources to overcome them, Cartman faces both external challenges and lacks the internal framework necessary to process and overcome adversity in healthy ways. His upbringing, family dynamics, socioeconomic status, and innate psychological makeup combine to create a situation where even his apparent victories become pyrrhic, ultimately serving to reinforce the very systems that trap him. The most immediate factor contributing to Cartman's doomed existence is his complete lack of stable, healthy relationships. While he surrounds himself with people he calls friends, these relationships are fundamentally transactional and manipulative. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny tolerate rather than genuinely like him. And this distinction isn't lost on Cartman, even if he can't consciously acknowledge it. The constant underlying tension in these relationships creates a state of perpetual insecurity for Cartman, who must constantly work to maintain connections that others take for granted. This exhausting emotional labor, combined with the inevitable betrayals and conflict that arise from his manipulative approach to friendship, creates a cycle where his desperate need for connection drives behavior that ultimately pushes people away. His relationship with his mother, Leanne, presents another fundamental problem that shapes every aspect of his existence. While on the surface it might seem advantageous to have a parent who rarely says no and constantly provides validation, the reality is far more complex and damaging. Leanne's inability to set boundaries or provide consistent guidance leaves Cartman without the essential framework children need to understand consequences, develop empathy, or learn to regulate their own behavior. Her permissiveness isn't kindness. It's a form of neglect that deprives Cartman of a structure necessary for healthy development. This dynamic creates a child who expects the world to accommodate his desires while simultaneously lacking the skills necessary to navigate situations where accommodation isn't forthcoming. The absence of a stable father figure compounds these issues exponentially. Children naturally seek out role models and authority figures to help them understand how to function in the world, particularly male figures for boys trying to understand masculinity and their role in society. Cartman's desperate attempts to find father figures, from joining various organizations to latching onto temporary male authority figures, reveal a deep hunger for guidance and validation that never gets satisfied. This absence forces him to construct his own understanding of masculinity and authority, often based on pop culture, media representations, or his own immature interpretations of power dynamics. Cartman's socioeconomic circumstances add another layer of complexity to his situation. While the Cartman family isn't destitute, they clearly struggle financially, and this struggle is often hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Cartman's materialistic desires and get-rich-quick schemes aren't just childish greed. They represent a deep understanding that economic status translates to social status and respect. His elaborate plans to achieve wealth and fame stem from an accurate assessment that his current circumstances don't command the respect and admiration he craves. The tragedy is that his methods for achieving these goals are fundamentally flawed, ensuring that he remains trapped in cycles of temporary success followed by inevitable failure. Perhaps most critically, Cartman appears to lack the innate emotional intelligence and empathy that allow most people to form genuine connections and learn from social feedback. While this might seem like a superpower that allows him to manipulate others without guilt, it's actually a profound disability that prevents him from experiencing the genuine satisfaction that comes from authentic relationships. His inability to truly understand or care about others' feelings means he can never experience the reciprocal care and understanding that forms the foundation of human happiness. He's essentially emotionally colorblind, able to mimic the forms of social interaction, but unable to access their actual substance. The combination of these factors creates a person who is simultaneously grandiose and insecure, confident and desperate, successful and doomed to failure. Cartman's life becomes an exhausting performance where he must constantly maintain a facade of superiority while dealing with the constant evidence that this facade doesn't reflect reality. His schemes become increasingly elaborate, not because they're more likely to succeed, but because he needs bigger and bigger victories to maintain his self-image in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary. What makes Cartman's situation particularly tragic is that many of his negative traits stem from adaptive responses to his circumstances. His manipulation skills developed because honest communication didn't get his needs met. His grandiosity emerged as protection against feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. His lack of empathy might be partially defensive, protecting him from emotional pain he lacks the tools to process. These adaptations, while destructive in the long term, likely served important functions in helping him survive his childhood circumstances. The ultimate tragedy of being born as Eric Cartman is that escape seems virtually impossible. His coping mechanisms have become so entrenched that they prevent him from developing healthier alternatives. His reputation and relationship patterns are so established that genuine change would require not just internal work, but also convincing others to see him differently, a nearly impossible task given his history. Most critically, his lack of self-awareness and inability to accept responsibility mean he's unlikely to seek help or recognize the need for change. He's trapped in a prison of his own making, with walls built from the very adaptations that once protected him, unable to see that the key to escape lies in abandoning the very behaviors that he believes define his strength. The absence of a stable, positive father figure in Eric Cartman's life represents perhaps the most fundamental wound in his psychological development. This void doesn't simply leave him without male guidance. It creates a gaping hole that distorts every aspect of his personality formation, from his understanding of masculinity and authority to his desperate attempts at control and validation. The tragedy lies not just in what Cartman lacks, but in how this absence shapes him into someone increasingly incapable of forming the very relationships that might heal this wound. From early childhood, boys naturally seek out male role models to help them understand their place in the world and develop a sense of masculine identity. Without a consistent father figure, Cartman has been forced to construct his own understanding of what it means to be a man, often drawing from the worst possible sources. His conception of masculinity becomes warped around power, dominance, and the ability to control others rather than qualities like responsibility, empathy, or genuine strength. This foundational misunderstanding colors every interaction he has with authority figures and peers, leading him to view relationships as zero-sum games where someone must dominate and someone must submit. The few father figures that do appear in Cartman's life are either absent, inadequate, or actively harmful, creating a pattern of abandonment that reinforces his deepest fears while teaching him that male authority figures cannot be trusted. Jack Tennerman, revealed to be his biological father, represents the ultimate abandonment. Not only was he absent from Cartman's life, but Cartman's ignorance of this relationship led to one of his most psychologically damaging acts. The revelation that he had essentially engineered his own father's death and consumed him in chilly form represents a trauma so profound that it's almost impossible to process. This event crystallizes everything wrong with Cartman's relationship to father figures. The absence created such desperate need for control and revenge that he destroyed the very thing he most needed. The parade of temporary male figures in Leanne's life creates its own form of psychological damage. Each new boyfriend represents a potential father figure, sparking hope in Cartman that quickly turns to disappointment and rage when these relationships inevitably end. This pattern teaches him that male authority figures are temporary, unreliable, and ultimately abandoning. Rather than learning to form healthy attachments to male mentors, Cartman develops a defensive stance where he attempts to control and manipulate these figures before they can leave him. His aggressive behavior toward his mother's boyfriends isn't just jealousy. It's a desperate attempt to gain control over a situation where he feels fundamentally powerless. This father hunger manifests in Cartman's relationship with authority figures throughout his life. His interactions with teachers, police officers, and other adult males are characterized by a peculiar combination of desperate need for approval and rebellious hostility. He craves their attention and validation, while simultaneously resenting their authority over him. This internal conflict leads to behavior that virtually guarantees negative attention, the only form of masculine engagement he feels capable of securing. When positive attention feels impossible or unsafe, negative attention becomes preferable to being ignored entirely. The absence of a father figure also deprives Cartman of crucial lessons about emotional regulation and conflict resolution. Fathers often serve as models for how to handle frustration, disappointment, and anger in constructive ways. Without this guidance, Cartman's emotional responses remain primitive and explosive. He never learns that vulnerability can coexist with strength, or that admitting mistakes can be more powerful than maintaining a false facade of perfection. Instead, he develops an understanding of masculinity that equates emotional expression with weakness and views any form of surrender or compromise as defeat. Perhaps most damaging is how this absence affects Cartman's ability to envision his own future. Without a positive male role model to emulate, he lacks a clear picture of what successful adult masculinity looks like. His goals and ambitions become grandiose fantasies rather than realistic achievements, because he has no template for the steady, consistent work that actual success requires. His schemes for fame and fortune reflect a child's understanding of achievement: dramatic, immediate, and requiring minimal actual effort or personal growth. The father wound also explains Cartman's peculiar relationship with competition and hierarchy. Without a father to teach him about healthy competition and cooperation, he views every interaction as a potential threat to his status. His desperate need to be seen as superior stems from deep insecurity about his worth and place in the social order. The absence of a secure attachment to a male authority figure means he cannot trust that his value is inherent. Instead, he must constantly prove and reprove his worth through dominance and control. This dynamic becomes particularly evident in his relationship with Kyle, who often serves as a proxy for all the authority figures who have disappointed him. The intensity of his hatred for Kyle goes far beyond simple rivalry. It represents his rage at every father figure who failed to provide the security and guidance he needed. Kyle's moral certainty and family stability trigger Cartman's deepest wounds, reminding him of everything he lacks while simultaneously representing the kind of grounded masculine identity he cannot access. The tragedy deepens when we consider how Cartman's behavior, shaped by this father absence, actually prevents him from forming relationships with potential father figures. His desperate need for control and his inability to show vulnerability make him an extremely difficult child for any adult to connect with. The very adaptations he developed to survive his abandonment ensure that he will continue to be abandoned. Male authority figures who might otherwise take an interest in helping him are quickly driven away by his manipulative and hostile behavior. Even more heartbreaking is how Cartman's understanding of fatherhood itself becomes distorted. When he occasionally interacts with other children's fathers or imagines his own future as a parent, His concepts are warped by his experiences of absence and abandonment. He cannot envision the quiet, consistent presence that healthy fatherhood requires because he has never experienced it. Instead, his ideas about being a father center around control, dominance, and the wielding of absolute authority, perpetuating the cycle of dysfunction that created him. The father wound also explains Cartman's attraction to extremist ideologies and strongman figures. In the absence of a personal father figure, he seeks out larger-than-life authority figures who promise simple answers and absolute control. These ideologies appeal to him not because he truly understands their implications, but because they offer the fantasy of unlimited masculine power that he associates with safety and worth. They provide a distorted sense of belonging to something greater than himself, while requiring no genuine vulnerability or personal growth. Ultimately, the absence of a father figure doesn't just leave Cartman without guidance. It actively shapes him into someone incapable of receiving the very thing he most needs. The wound becomes self-perpetuating, ensuring that even when opportunities for healthy male mentorship arise, his defensive behaviors and impossible expectations will sabotage these relationships. He remains trapped in a cycle of abandonment that began before he could consciously understand it, forever seeking something he lacks the tools to recognize or accept when it appears. Leanne Cartman's parenting style represents one of the most insidious forms of child abuse disguised as love. The complete absence of boundaries, consequences, or emotional guidance that leaves a child adrift in a world they cannot comprehend or navigate successfully. While her permissive approach might appear kind or even indulgent on the surface, it actually constitutes a profound form of neglect that has shaped Eric into a fundamentally dysfunctional human being incapable of forming healthy relationships or achieving genuine satisfaction in life. The most immediate and obvious problem with Leanne's parenting is her complete inability to say no to her son. This isn't occasional indulgence or pick-your-battles flexibility. It's a systematic abdication of parental responsibility that has taught Cartman that his desires are not only valid, but should be the primary consideration in any situation. When a child never encounters meaningful resistance to their demands, they never develop the crucial psychological muscles necessary for dealing with frustration, disappointment, or delayed gratification. Cartman's explosive reactions to even minor obstacles stem directly from a lifetime of having his path cleared by a mother who prioritizes short-term peace over long-term development. This dynamic has created a person who genuinely cannot understand why the world doesn't revolve around his needs and desires. Leanne's consistent message that Eric's comfort is more important than rules, other people's feelings, or even basic social conventions has produced someone who experiences normal social boundaries as personal attacks. When teachers expect him to follow classroom rules, when friends decline to participate in his schemes, or when society expects him to consider others' needs, Cartman feels genuinely victimized because his mother has taught him that such expectations are unreasonable. The enabling goes far beyond simple permissiveness into active participation in his dysfunction. Leanne doesn't just fail to correct Cartman's bad behavior. She often facilitates it. She provides alibis for his schemes, makes excuses for his failures, and consistently frames him as the victim in situations where he is clearly the aggressor. This teaches Cartman that accountability is optional and that there will always be someone willing to rescue him from the consequences of his actions. The result is a person who has never developed the internal mechanisms necessary for self-reflection, personal growth, or a genuine responsibility. Perhaps even more damaging is how Leanne's emotional neediness has forced Cartman into an inappropriate caretaking role that has stunted his own emotional development. Rather than providing the emotional stability and security that children need, Leanne often looks to Eric for validation, comfort, and even protection. This role reversal places an impossible burden on a child who lacks the cognitive and emotional tools necessary for such responsibility. Cartman's grandiose sense of self-importance isn't just narcissism. It's partially a survival mechanism developed to handle responsibilities that no child should bear. The sexual inappropriateness that characterizes much of Leanne's behavior around Eric represents another layer of dysfunction that has profoundly warped his understanding of boundaries, relationships, and appropriate behavior. Children need parents to model healthy emotional regulation and appropriate interpersonal boundaries. Instead, Leanne's own poor boundaries and inappropriate emotional dumping have taught Cartman that manipulation, emotional volatility, and boundary violations are normal aspects of intimate relationships. This early training explains much of his problematic behavior toward others. He simply has no template for healthy interaction. Leanne's inability to provide consistent structure or routine has left Cartman without the internal framework necessary for self-regulation and goal achievement. Children develop the capacity for self-discipline and delayed gratification through experiencing consistent external structure that gradually becomes internalized. Without this foundation, Cartman remains perpetually stuck in a childlike state where immediate gratification feels like a necessity rather than a choice. His inability to stick with projects, maintain commitments, or work toward long-term goals stems directly from never having learned that satisfaction can come from sustained effort rather than immediate reward. The financial anxiety that permeates the Cartman household, combined with Leanne's attempts to hide these struggles from Eric, has created a particularly toxic dynamic around money and status. Rather than teaching him realistic expectations about work, money, and social class, Leanne's attempts to maintain appearances have taught Cartman that financial struggles are shameful secrets to be hidden through elaborate pretenses. This has produced someone who views wealth as a magic solution to all problems while lacking any understanding of the sustained effort required to achieve financial stability. Most tragically, Leanne's parenting style has deprived Cartman of the opportunity to develop genuine self-esteem based on actual accomplishments and personal growth. Her constant praise and validation, regardless of his behavior or achievements, has taught him that self-worth comes from external validation rather than internal development. This creates a person who is simultaneously grandiose and insecure, constantly seeking bigger and bigger external validations to fill an internal void that can never be satisfied through external means alone. The enabling relationship has also prevented Cartman from developing the crucial ability to form genuine intimacy with others. Leanne's unconditional acceptance, while seeming loving, actually teaches him that love means never having to change, grow, or consider others' needs. Real intimacy requires the ability to be vulnerable, to accept feedback, and to modify behavior based on how it affects others. Since Cartman has never experienced this type of conditional acceptance based on mutual respect and growth, he cannot offer it to others or recognize it when others attempt to offer it to him. Perhaps most insidiously, Leanne's parenting style has created a person who is fundamentally incapable of experiencing genuine happiness or satisfaction. Because he has never had to work for validation or overcome meaningful challenges, Cartman cannot access the deep satisfaction that comes from genuine achievement. His victories feel hollow because they required no real effort or growth, while his failures feel catastrophic because he lacks the resilience that comes from having overcome obstacles through personal development. The codependent relationship between Leanne and Eric has also trapped them both in a cycle where change becomes increasingly impossible. Leanne's identity has become so wrapped up in being the good mother who always supports her son that she cannot risk the temporary conflict that setting boundaries would require. Meanwhile, Cartman's entire self-concept is built around being someone whose needs should be automatically met, making any move toward independence or self-sufficiency feel like a fundamental threat to his identity. The tragic irony is that Leanne's attempts to protect Eric from pain, disappointment, and frustration have actually guaranteed that he will experience far more suffering throughout his life than if she had provided appropriate structure and consequences. Her enabling has created someone who is essentially handicapped in dealing with the normal challenges of human existence, ensuring that he will face constant frustration, disappointment, and social rejection without the internal resources necessary to cope with or learn from these experiences. This dynamic explains why Cartman's future prospects appear so bleak. Not because he lacks intelligence or potential, but because the foundational skills necessary for success in relationships, work, and personal satisfaction were never developed during the crucial developmental years when Leanne should have been providing structure, boundaries, and appropriate consequences rather than unconditional enablement disguised as love. The cruel irony of Eric Cartman's social existence lies in the fact that despite being constantly surrounded by people he considers friends, he remains fundamentally and profoundly alone. His relationships with Stan, Kyle, and Kenny represent one of the most tragic examples of how manipulative behavior, while sometimes achieving short-term goals, ultimately creates a prison of isolation that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that Cartman's desperate need for genuine connection drives the very behaviors that make authentic friendship impossible. From the outside, it might appear that Cartman has achieved something many struggle with, a consistent social group that has remained stable throughout his childhood. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny have been part of his life for years, participating in his schemes, tolerating his outbursts, and maintaining some form of relationship despite his obvious flaws. However, a closer examination reveals that these relationships exist not because of genuine affection or mutual respect, but because of a complex web of social inertia, geographic proximity, and the boy's own psychological needs that Cartman inadvertently fulfills. The relationship with Kyle represents the most complex and psychologically revealing dynamic in Cartman's social world. What appears to be simple antagonism actually masks a deep, obsessive need for Kyle's attention and validation. Cartman's elaborate schemes to humiliate or defeat Kyle aren't just expressions of hatred. They're desperate attempts to force a connection with someone whose moral certainty and family stability represent everything Cartman lacks. The intensity of his focus on Kyle reveals how starved he is for meaningful engagement, even when that engagement takes the form of conflict rather than friendship. Kyle, for his part, remains engaged in this toxic dynamic partly because Cartman provides him with a clear moral opponent against which to define himself. This creates a codependent relationship where both boys need each other to maintain their sense of identity, but neither can acknowledge this need without undermining their conscious understanding of their relationship. Kyle's periodic attempts to help or understand Cartman represent genuine impulses toward compassion, but these efforts are inevitably sabotaged by Cartman's inability to accept help without trying to exploit it. Stan's role in the group dynamic reveals another aspect of Cartman's isolation. The way his presence can simultaneously provide entertainment and create exhaustion for those around him. Stan often serves as the voice of reason who points out the obvious flaws in Cartman's schemes. But his continued participation suggests that Cartman fulfills some need for excitement and drama in an otherwise routine small-town existence. However, this utility-based relationship means that Stan's tolerance has clear limits, and his friendship is always conditional on Cartman providing some form of value rather than being intrinsically worthwhile. Kenny's relationship with Cartman perhaps most clearly illustrates the transactional nature of all of Cartman's friendships. Kenny's economic disadvantage makes him vulnerable to Cartman's occasional generosity, but this dynamic reinforces Cartman's understanding of relationships as power exchanges rather than mutual support systems. When Cartman helps Kenny, it's almost always in service of some larger scheme or to demonstrate his own superiority rather than from genuine care. This pattern teaches both boys that friendship is about leverage and utility rather than emotional connection. The most tragic aspect of these relationships is how they prevent Cartman from developing the skills necessary for genuine friendship, while simultaneously giving him just enough social contact to avoid the complete isolation that might force self-reflection and change. He receives enough attention and engagement to feel that his social needs are being met, but this attention comes at the cost of constantly performing his worst traits. The boy's tolerance of his behavior, while perhaps intended as kindness or friendship, actually enables his dysfunction by providing social rewards for manipulative and harmful behavior. Cartman's inability to maintain friendships outside of this core group reveals how his reputation and behavioral patterns have created a social prison that extends beyond just these three relationships. Other children in South Park have learned to avoid him, having experienced his manipulation, selfishness, and betrayal firsthand. His rare attempts to form new friendships typically follow the same patterns: initial charm and apparent generosity, followed by increasingly obvious attempts at manipulation and control. This consistency ensures that his social world remains limited to those who, for various reasons, cannot or will not completely disengage from him. The manipulation tactics that Cartman employs to maintain these relationships — guilt trips, emotional blackmail, false victimhood, and occasional genuine gestures of friendship — create a confusing dynamic that keeps his friends off balance and unable to fully reject him. These tactics work precisely because they contain just enough genuine need and vulnerability to trigger the natural human impulse to help others. However, because Cartman cannot distinguish between strategic vulnerability and authentic emotional openness, he cannot access the genuine support and understanding that his friends might actually be willing to offer. Perhaps most importantly, Cartman's approach to friendship prevents him from experiencing the emotional satisfaction that genuine connection provides. Because he views every interaction through the lens of power dynamics and personal advantage, he cannot simply enjoy someone's company or feel grateful for their presence in his life. Even his victories in social situations feel hollow because they were achieved through manipulation rather than earned through authentic connection. This creates a cycle where his social successes feel empty, driving him to seek bigger and more elaborate victories that ultimately leave him feeling even more isolated. The group dynamic also reveals how Cartman's presence affects the quality of friendships among the other boys. His constant schemes and drama often prevent Stan, Kyle, and Kenny from developing deeper connections with each other, as their interactions become focused on managing Cartman's latest crisis or protecting themselves from his manipulations. In this way, his isolation becomes a contagion that degrades the social environment for everyone around him. Most tragically, Cartman appears to have some awareness of his isolation, evidenced by his desperate attempts to force intimacy through grand gestures, emotional manipulation, or manufactured crises that require his friends' attention. These attempts reveal a deep hunger for genuine connection, but his methods ensure that any attention he receives feels conditional and temporary. He cannot trust that his friends would choose to spend time with him if they weren't somehow compelled to do so, which means that even when they do show him kindness or loyalty, he cannot fully believe in or enjoy it. The ultimate tragedy of Cartman's social isolation is that it's largely self-imposed and self-perpetuating. His friends have shown, time and again, that they are willing to forgive his mistakes and include him in their lives. However, his inability to trust their affection or accept their friendship without trying to control it ensures that he remains fundamentally alone, even when surrounded by people who, despite everything, continue to tolerate and occasionally care about him. The psychology of Eric Cartman presents a textbook case of narcissistic personality traits developing as survival mechanisms in response to profound emotional neglect and abandonment. What many perceive as simple selfishness or evil actually represents a complex psychological defense system designed to protect an extraordinarily vulnerable ego from the devastating reality of his circumstances. Understanding Cartman's narcissism as a maladaptive coping strategy rather than an inherent character flaw reveals the true tragedy of his existence. He has become trapped within the very defenses that once protected him, unable to access genuine happiness or connection. The grandiose self-image that Cartman maintains serves as armor against feelings of worthlessness and abandonment that would otherwise be overwhelming for a child to process. His constant declarations of superiority, his elaborate fantasies of fame and success, and his refusal to acknowledge his own limitations aren't expressions of genuine confidence. They're desperate attempts to maintain a sense of self-worth in the face of constant evidence that he is unloved, unsuccessful, and fundamentally alone. This false self becomes so elaborate and consuming that Cartman loses touch with his authentic feelings and needs, creating a person who can neither accurately assess reality nor access the vulnerability necessary for genuine connection. The lack of empathy that characterizes Cartman's interactions with others represents another crucial defense mechanism that has become pathological over time. Children who experience chronic emotional neglect often develop the ability to shut down their emotional responses as a way of protecting themselves from pain. What begins as a necessary survival skill, the ability to not feel hurt when caregivers are consistently unavailable or harmful, eventually becomes a generalized inability to access emotional depth in any relationship. Cartman's apparent indifference to others' suffering isn't evidence of inherent evil, but rather the result of emotional numbing that has become so complete he can no longer distinguish between protecting himself and harming others. This emotional shutdown creates a person who must rely on external validation rather than internal satisfaction for any sense of worth or happiness. Because Cartman cannot access genuine feelings of accomplishment, love, or contentment, he becomes desperately dependent on others' reactions to feel anything at all. This explains his need for constant attention, even when that attention is negative, and his tendency to escalate his behavior when he feels ignored. The narcissistic supply he seeks through manipulation and drama isn't just wanted, it's psychologically necessary for him to maintain any sense of existing as a person. The manipulation tactics that Cartman employs represent sophisticated psychological strategies that likely developed as survival mechanisms in his early relationship with his mother. Children who grow up with inconsistent, emotionally unavailable, or overwhelmed caregivers often become experts at reading emotional cues and manipulating situations to get their needs met. What appears to be Cartman's natural talent for psychological manipulation actually represents years of practice at managing a parent who couldn't provide consistent emotional support. These skills, while adaptive in his family system, become destructive when applied to relationships with peers and authority figures who expect honesty and reciprocity. The need for constant validation that drives much of Cartman's behavior stems from a complete absence of internalized self-worth. Healthy children develop the ability to self-soothe and maintain confidence even when external validation is unavailable because they've experienced enough consistent love and support to internalize positive feelings about themselves. Cartman's constant need for praise, attention, and acknowledgement reveals that this internalization process never occurred. He remains trapped in an infantile state where his emotional regulation depends entirely on others' responses to him, making him extraordinarily vulnerable to criticism or rejection while simultaneously driving behavior that virtually guarantees both. The projection and blame shifting that characterize Cartman's response to failure represent another layer of psychological defense designed to protect an ego too fragile to handle responsibility for mistakes. Acknowledging genuine fault would require accessing the shame and vulnerability that his entire psychological structure has been designed to avoid. This creates a person who cannot learn from experience because he cannot accurately assess his role in negative outcomes. Every failure must be someone else's fault. Every criticism must be evidence of others' inadequacy rather than his own, because accepting responsibility would threaten the elaborate psychological edifice that protects him from unbearable feelings of worthlessness. The perfectionism and grandiosity that drive Cartman's schemes represent attempts to achieve a level of success so complete and undeniable that it would finally provide the security and validation he desperately needs. His plans are always elaborate and ambitious because small successes cannot fill the enormous void created by years of emotional neglect. He needs to become famous, wealthy, and universally admired because only achievements of that magnitude feel significant enough to counteract the deep sense of inadequacy that drives all his behavior. The tragedy is that even when his schemes temporarily succeed, the satisfaction is fleeting because external achievements cannot heal internal wounds. The rage and vindictiveness that Cartman displays when his narcissistic supply is threatened represent the emotional equivalent of a cornered animal fighting for survival. When his grandiose self-image is challenged, or when he feels rejected or abandoned, the primitive terror of emotional annihilation that his defenses were designed to prevent comes flooding back. His extreme reactions to perceived slights aren't proportional to the actual offense because they're not really responses to present circumstances. They're responses to the accumulated trauma of a lifetime of emotional abandonment and neglect. Perhaps most tragically, the very defenses that once protected Cartman from psychological destruction have become the primary obstacles to his healing and happiness. His inability to show genuine vulnerability prevents him from forming the authentic connections that might provide real emotional support. His need to maintain grandiosity prevents him from acknowledging problems that could be addressed through appropriate help. His lack of empathy prevents him from understanding how his behavior affects others, making it impossible for him to modify his approach in ways that might actually get his needs met. The narcissistic personality structure also creates a person who cannot experience genuine satisfaction or happiness because all positive experiences are filtered through the lens of ego validation rather than authentic enjoyment. Cartman cannot simply enjoy a beautiful day, a good meal, or a friend's company because every experience must be evaluated in terms of what it says about his worth and status. This constant self-monitoring and comparison rob him of the simple pleasures that make life meaningful for most people. Most heartbreakingly, Cartman's narcissistic defenses prevent him from accessing the very things he most desperately needs: genuine love, authentic connection, and realistic hope for the future. The walls he has built to protect himself have become a prison that keeps out not only potential harm, but also potential healing, ensuring that he remains trapped in cycles of emptiness and desperation that no amount of external validation can truly fill. Eric Cartman's academic career represents a perfect storm of wasted potential, self-sabotage, and the tragic consequences of never learning how to handle failure constructively. Despite possessing obvious intelligence and creativity, his approach to education reveals someone fundamentally incapable of the sustained effort, humility, and resilience that genuine achievement requires. His consistent failures in school aren't simply the result of laziness or lack of ability. They represent the inevitable outcome of a psychological framework that makes learning and growth virtually impossible. The most obvious manifestation of Cartman's academic dysfunction is his complete inability to accept criticism or feedback from teachers. When educators attempt to correct his work or suggest improvements, Cartman experiences these interactions not as helpful guidance, but as personal attacks on his worth and intelligence. This defensive response stems directly from his narcissistic need to maintain a grandiose self-image that cannot accommodate the possibility of being wrong or needing improvement. Rather than viewing mistakes as opportunities for learning, he sees them as threats to his fundamental sense of self, leading to explosive reactions that further alienate him from the very people trying to help him succeed. His relationship with homework and studying reveals another crucial aspect of his academic failure: the complete absence of delayed gratification skills necessary for educational success. Cartman approaches assignments with the expectation that they should be easy, immediately rewarding, and require minimal effort. When faced with tasks that demand sustained concentration, research, or practice, he quickly becomes frustrated and abandons the work in favor of more immediately gratifying activities. This pattern isn't simply procrastination. It's a fundamental inability to tolerate the discomfort and uncertainty that learning requires. The elaborate schemes Cartman devises to avoid academic work often require far more creativity and effort than simply completing the assignments would have demanded. His willingness to forge documents, manipulate teachers, or create elaborate deceptions reveals both his intelligence and the tragic misdirection of his energies. These schemes represent his attempt to achieve academic success without submitting to the learning process, maintaining his grandiose self-image while avoiding the vulnerability that genuine learning requires. The irony is that his schemes often demonstrate exactly the kind of planning, creativity, and problem-solving skills that could make him academically successful if applied constructively. Cartman's behavior during group projects illuminates another dimension of his academic struggles: his complete inability to collaborate effectively with peers. Group work requires compromise, shared responsibility, and the ability to integrate others' ideas with your own, skills that Cartman's narcissistic framework makes virtually impossible. Instead of contributing to team efforts, he typically attempts to dominate the group, assign himself the easiest tasks, or take credit for others' work. This pattern ensures that his classmates learn to avoid working with him, further isolating him from potential learning opportunities and social connections. His relationship with standardized testing and grades reveals the toxic perfectionism that underlies much of his academic dysfunction. Cartman cannot tolerate being average or mediocre, yet he also cannot tolerate the sustained effort required for genuine excellence. This creates an impossible psychological bind where he needs to achieve perfect results without engaging in the imperfect process of learning. When his grades inevitably fall short of his grandiose expectations, he experiences crushing shame that must be immediately deflected through blame, excuses, or grandiose claims about the inadequacy of the educational system itself. The pattern of academic self-sabotage becomes particularly evident in subjects where Cartman shows initial promise or interest. Rather than building on these strengths, he often abandons promising projects or deliberately undermines his own success when the work becomes challenging or when success would require acknowledging help from others. Feel alive and important. The religious phase jumping that characterizes much of Cartman's spiritual exploration reveals how his search for identity extends into the most fundamental questions of meaning and purpose. His brief conversions to Christianity, Judaism, and other faiths follow a predictable pattern: initial enthusiasm based on perceived benefits or advantages, superficial engagement with actual doctrine or practice, and eventual abandonment when the religion fails to provide immediate gratification or requires genuine commitment to moral principles. His approach to religion exemplifies his broader relationship with identity, seeking external frameworks that can provide meaning and structure without requiring internal transformation. The political dimensions of Cartman's identity crisis become particularly disturbing because they reveal how vulnerable he is to manipulation by movements that promise easy answers and scapegoats for complex problems. His periodic embrace of various political ideologies, from libertarianism to authoritarianism, demonstrates how someone without a stable moral foundation can be recruited into dangerous movements that exploit their need for belonging and superiority. The ease with which he adopts contradictory political positions reveals that his engagement is entirely emotional and social rather than intellectual or principled. Cultural appropriation represents another manifestation of Cartman's identity confusion, as he periodically adopts the superficial markers of various ethnic, cultural, or subcultural identities without any genuine understanding or respect for their deeper meaning. These episodes reveal his fundamental misunderstanding of how identity actually works. His belief that adopting external symbols or behaviors can instantly provide the sense of belonging and authenticity that he lacks. The offensive nature of many of these appropriations stems from his inability to see other cultures as anything more than costumes he can wear when his current identity feels inadequate. The speed with which Cartman cycles through different identities reveals the desperation underlying his search for belonging. Normal identity development involves gradual exploration, genuine interest in different possibilities, and slow integration of various influences into a coherent sense of self. Cartman's rapid adoption and abandonment of different identities suggests someone who is not exploring, but frantically searching for something that can immediately fill an unbearable void. When each new identity fails to provide instant satisfaction and transformation, he must quickly move on to the next possibility rather than engaging in the difficult work of authentic self-development. His inability to commit to any identity long enough to gain genuine understanding or experience real, belonging creates a cycle where each abandoned identity leaves him more convinced that satisfaction is impossible and more desperate to find the right group or belief system. The failure of each identity experiment isn't seen as evidence that his approach is flawed, but rather as proof that he simply hasn't found the correct external solution to his internal problems. This pattern ensures that he remains trapped in superficial identity experimentation rather than engaging in the deeper psychological work that might actually provide stability and satisfaction. The social consequences of this identity instability extend far beyond Cartman's personal confusion into his relationships with others. People learn that his enthusiasms and commitments are temporary and superficial, making it difficult for them to take his interests seriously or invest in shared activities. His reputation for abandoning groups and movements makes him an unreliable member who cannot be trusted with important responsibilities or trusted to maintain long-term commitments. This creates additional isolation precisely when he most needs stable relationships to support genuine identity development. The intellectual dishonesty required to rapidly switch between contradictory belief systems also prevents Cartman from developing the critical thinking skills necessary for genuine philosophical and moral development. Instead of wrestling with complex ideas and gradually developing his own principled positions, he adopts prepackaged ideologies wholesale and defends them with the same superficial arguments regardless of their actual merit. This pattern ensures that his intellectual development remains stunted while his capacity for self-deception and rationalization grows stronger. Perhaps most tragically, Cartman's frantic search for external identity prevents him from discovering who he actually is underneath all the adopted personas and group affiliations. His authentic interests, values, and personality traits remain unexplored because all his energy goes into trying on different identities rather than developing his genuine self. The person he might actually be, with all his real strengths and limitations, never gets the opportunity to emerge and develop because he's constantly trying to become someone else. The ultimate irony of Cartman's identity crisis is that his desperate search for belonging actually ensures his continued isolation. His instrumental approach to groups and ideologies prevents him from forming the genuine connections that might actually provide the sense of belonging he seeks. His unwillingness to engage in authentic self-reflection means he cannot develop the stable sense of self that would make external validation less necessary. He remains trapped in a cycle where his methods of seeking identity actively prevent him from finding it, ensuring continued confusion, isolation, and desperation. The absence of genuine empathy in Eric Cartman's psychological makeup represents perhaps the most devastating aspect of his condition. Not because it makes him cruel, though it certainly enables cruelty, but because it cuts him off from the fundamental human experiences that make life meaningful and satisfying. This emotional blindness isn't simply a character flaw or moral failing. It's a profound disability that ensures he will never experience the reciprocal care, understanding, and connection that form the foundation of human happiness. While his lack of empathy might sometimes appear to be a superpower that allows him to manipulate others without guilt, it actually condemns him to a lifetime of emotional poverty that no amount of external success could ever fill. The empathy deficit manifests most obviously in Cartman's complete inability to understand how his actions affect others or why their emotional responses should matter to him. When friends express hurt, anger, or disappointment at his behavior, he experiences these reactions not as meaningful feedback about the impact of his choices, but as inexplicable obstacles to his goals or attempts to manipulate him. This fundamental misunderstanding of emotional cause and effect means he cannot learn from social feedback, adjust his behavior based on others' needs, or develop the reciprocal relationships that provide life's deepest satisfactions. What makes this deficit particularly tragic is that empathy serves not just as a moral constraint that prevents harmful behavior, but as a crucial social skill that enables genuine connection and mutual support. People who can understand and share others' emotions naturally develop relationships characterized by trust, intimacy, and reciprocal care. Cartman's emotional blindness prevents him from accessing this entire dimension of human experience, leaving him trapped in relationships that are purely transactional and ultimately unsatisfying for everyone involved. The cognitive aspects of Cartman's empathy deficit reveal themselves in his consistent inability to accurately predict how others will respond to his actions. Normal social functioning requires the ability to mentally simulate others' perspectives and anticipate their emotional reactions, a skill that allows for successful cooperation, conflict resolution, and relationship maintenance. Cartman's schemes consistently fail not because they're poorly planned in a technical sense, but because they're based on fundamental misunderstandings of human motivation and emotional response. He cannot succeed in his manipulations because he cannot truly understand the people he's trying to manipulate. This emotional blindness also prevents Cartman from experiencing the satisfaction that comes from making others happy or relieving their suffering. Normal humans derive enormous pleasure from acts of kindness, generosity, and support precisely because they can empathetically experience the positive emotions they create in others. Cartman's inability to share in others' happiness means that even his occasional acts of apparent kindness provide no genuine satisfaction, leaving him constantly seeking other sources of gratification that can never fill the void left by his inability to connect with others' joy. The isolation created by his empathy deficit extends beyond just missing positive emotional connections to include an inability to receive comfort and support during difficult times. When others attempt to offer sympathy, understanding, or emotional support, Cartman cannot recognize or appreciate these gestures because he cannot understand the emotional framework from which they emerge. This leaves him to face life's inevitable challenges and disappointments without the emotional support systems that help most people cope with adversity, making every setback more devastating and harder to recover from. Perhaps most tragically, Cartman's lack of empathy prevents him from developing the moral framework necessary for genuine self-respect and ethical behavior. Empathy typically serves as the emotional foundation for moral reasoning. We avoid harming others partly because we can imagine and feel their pain, and we help others partly because we can share in their relief and gratitude. Without this emotional foundation, Cartman's moral reasoning remains purely intellectual and self-serving, preventing him from developing the principled behavior that might actually earn him the respect and admiration he desperately seeks. The empathy deficit also creates a profound barrier to personal growth and self-understanding. Much of what we learn about ourselves comes through observing how others respond to us and gradually understanding the impact of our personality and behavior on those around us. Cartman's inability to accurately read or care about others' emotional responses means he cannot use social feedback to develop self-awareness or modify problematic aspects of his personality. He remains trapped in patterns of behavior that consistently produce negative outcomes without understanding why these patterns are problematic. The emotional poverty created by this deficit manifests in Cartman's constant need for increasingly intense stimulation to feel anything at all. Without access to the subtle but profound satisfactions that come from empathetic connection, he must seek gratification through dramatic schemes, conflicts, and manipulations that provide the emotional intensity he cannot access through normal human interaction. This creates a person who is constantly escalating his behavior in search of stimulation, making it increasingly difficult for others to tolerate his presence and further deepening his isolation. The cognitive load of trying to navigate social situations without empathy also creates enormous stress and exhaustion for Cartman. Where most people can rely on emotional intuition to guide their social choices, he must consciously calculate and strategize every interaction, trying to achieve through manipulation what others accomplish naturally through genuine care and understanding. This constant effort to simulate normal social functioning while lacking the emotional tools that make it possible creates a persistent state of social anxiety and frustration. Most heartbreakingly, Cartman's empathy deficit prevents him from recognizing and appreciating the genuine care that others do occasionally show him. When friends forgive his mistakes, include him in activities despite his behavior, or show concern for his well-being, He cannot recognize these acts as expressions of love because he cannot understand the emotional impulses that motivate them. This inability to recognize love when it's offered ensures that even the positive relationships in his life feel empty and transactional to him. The ultimate tragedy of Cartman's emotional blindness is that it creates a self-perpetuating cycle where his inability to connect with others emotionally drives behavior that makes emotional connection impossible. His lack of empathy leads to actions that hurt and alienate others, which reduces their willingness to show him care and understanding, which increases his isolation and emotional poverty, which further reduces his capacity for empathy. He becomes trapped in a downward spiral where his greatest disability creates the very conditions that make overcoming that disability impossible, ensuring a lifetime of emotional poverty despite being constantly surrounded by potential sources of connection and care. Eric Cartman's relationship with authority represents one of the most self-destructive patterns in his already chaotic existence, virtually guaranteeing that he will remain unemployable, unsuccessful, and increasingly isolated as he transitions from childhood into adulthood. His fundamental inability to accept direction, follow rules, or acknowledge anyone else's legitimate authority stems from deep psychological wounds and defensive patterns that, while perhaps adaptive in his dysfunctional family system, render him completely unsuited for functioning in any structured environment. This creates a tragic trajectory where his need for control and dominance ensures that he will never access the stability, income, and social connection that come from successful participation in organized society. The most immediate manifestation of Cartman's authority issues appears in his interactions with teachers, coaches, and other adult figures who attempt to provide structure or guidance. Rather than viewing these authority relationships as potentially beneficial or even neutral, Cartman experiences them as direct threats to his grandiose self-image and need for control. When a teacher corrects his work, assigns homework, or enforces classroom rules, he doesn't see educational guidance. He sees personal attacks that must be resisted, undermined, or somehow turned to his advantage. This automatic defensive response makes learning impossible while simultaneously alienating the very people who might otherwise help him develop. His workplace prospects appear particularly grim when viewed through the lens of his inability to accept supervision or constructive criticism. Modern employment, regardless of the specific field, requires the ability to take direction from supervisors, collaborate with colleagues, and adapt behavior based on feedback from managers or clients. Cartman's psychological framework makes all of these basic workplace skills virtually impossible. His need to be in control conflicts directly with the hierarchical structure that characterizes most work environments, while his inability to tolerate criticism prevents him from learning new skills or improving his performance based on feedback. The deeper psychological roots of these authority issues trace back to his relationship with his mother, but the complete absence of appropriate boundaries in his childhood. Having never experienced healthy authority, structure that combines clear expectations with genuine care and support, Cartman cannot distinguish between legitimate leadership and arbitrary control. Every authority figure becomes a potential liane, someone to be manipulated and controlled, or a potential threat to be resisted and undermined. This black and white thinking prevents him from developing the nuanced understanding of authority relationships that successful adults require. His attempts to circumvent or manipulate authority figures reveal both his intelligence and the tragic misdirection of his capabilities. The energy and creativity he devotes to avoiding work, undermining supervisors, or creating elaborate schemes to escape consequences could easily be channeled into actual achievement if he could tolerate the temporary discomfort of accepting guidance and following rules. Instead, these abilities become liabilities that ensure his continued failure while reinforcing his belief that authority figures are obstacles to be overcome rather than resources for growth and development. The entrepreneurial fantasies that dominate much of Cartman's thinking about his future career prospects represent his attempt to escape authority relationships entirely. His dreams of being his own boss, starting his own business, or achieving fame and fortune through individual effort stem from his accurate understanding that he cannot function in traditional employment structures. However, these fantasies consistently fail to account for the reality that even self-employment requires accepting constraints, meeting client expectations, and following regulations, all forms of external authority that he cannot tolerate any better than traditional supervision. The social consequences of his authority issues extend far beyond just employment difficulties into every area of structured social interaction. Sports teams, volunteer organizations, hobby clubs, and even informal social groups typically require some degree of shared leadership and mutual accountability. Cartman's need to dominate or control these situations makes him unsuitable for membership in most organized activities, further limiting his opportunities for social connection and personal development as he ages. His relationship with legal and governmental authority presents particularly concerning implications for his future. His tendency to view rules as suggestions, laws as obstacles to be circumvented, and legal consequences as unfair persecutions suggests someone headed for serious conflicts with law enforcement and the justice system. The same psychological patterns that make him impossible to manage in a classroom or workplace will eventually bring him into contact with authorities who have real power to limit his freedom and opportunities. The economic implications of his unemployability cannot be overstated. In a society where most people derive income, insurance, social connection, and personal identity through employment, someone who cannot function in work environments faces prospects of poverty, isolation, and social marginalization. Cartman's authority issues essentially guarantee that he will remain dependent on others for support, while simultaneously alienating the very people whose help he needs through his impossible behavior and demands. Perhaps most tragically, his authority issues prevent him from accessing the mentorship and guidance that could potentially help him develop better coping strategies and social skills. Healthy relationships with authority figures, teachers, supervisors, coaches, or therapists often provide the corrective experiences that can help people overcome early trauma and develop more adaptive patterns. Cartman's automatic resistance to authority ensures that he will reject help even when it's offered, maintaining his dysfunctional patterns through conscious choice rather than simple lack of opportunity. The future trajectory suggested by these patterns points toward increasing isolation, economic marginalization, and social conflict. As his peers develop careers, form families, and build stable adult lives, Cartman's inability to function in structured environments will leave him increasingly behind. His schemes and manipulations may provide temporary income or excitement, but they cannot substitute for the sustained effort and cooperative relationships that create genuine security and satisfaction. The psychological toll of being unemployable extends beyond just financial concerns into fundamental questions of purpose and self-worth. Work provides not just income, but also structure, social connection, opportunities for achievement, and a sense of contributing to something larger than oneself. Cartman's authority issues deprive him of access to these crucial sources of meaning and satisfaction, leaving him to construct purpose through increasingly desperate and antisocial means. Most heartbreakingly, his authority issues represent a tragic waste of genuine potential. His intelligence, creativity, and energy could contribute meaningfully to almost any field if he could develop the psychological flexibility necessary to work within structured environments. Instead, these strengths become weapons in his war against authority, ensuring that his capabilities serve only to make him more effectively self-destructive while preventing the collaborative achievements that might actually provide the recognition and success he desperately seeks. The tragic irony of Eric Cartman's existence lies in the undeniable presence of genuine talent and intelligence that, rather than serving as assets for success and happiness, have become the very instruments of his destruction. His remarkable creativity, strategic thinking, and ability to inspire others could have made him a successful entrepreneur, artist, leader, or innovator under different circumstances. Instead, these gifts have been channeled through his dysfunctional psychological framework into elaborate schemes, manipulative plots, and destructive enterprises that consistently produce failure, isolation, and suffering for himself and others. The waste of human potential this represents is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of his story. Cartman's creative abilities are genuinely extraordinary, as evidenced by his capacity to conceive and execute complex plans that often require sophisticated understanding of psychology, logistics, and human motivation. His schemes frequently demonstrate the kind of innovative thinking that successful entrepreneurs and creative professionals employ in legitimate contexts. The elaborate nature of his plots, from creating fake businesses to orchestrating social events to developing entertainment concepts, reveals someone with genuine talent for project management, creative problem solving, and strategic planning. These are precisely the skills that could lead to meaningful professional success if applied constructively. His intelligence manifests not just in academic potential, but in his sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, psychological manipulation, and systems thinking. Cartman can quickly identify people's weaknesses, desires, and pressure points, then develop strategies to exploit these insights for his own benefit. This level of social intelligence, when properly channeled, forms the foundation for successful careers in sales, marketing, psychology, politics, or any field requiring deep understanding of human motivation. The fact that he possesses these abilities at such a young age suggests enormous potential for development if his talents were directed toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The leadership abilities that Cartman occasionally displays represent another dimension of wasted potential. Despite his obvious character flaws, he sometimes demonstrates the capacity to inspire others, organize group efforts, and maintain focus on long-term objectives. Other children, despite knowing his track record, continue to participate in his schemes, suggesting that he possesses genuine charismatic appeal and persuasive abilities. These natural leadership qualities, if developed within a healthy moral framework, could enable him to make significant positive contributions to any organization or community. His artistic and entertainment talents provide yet another example of gifts that could flourish under different circumstances. Cartman has shown genuine ability in music, performance, and creative writing, producing works that are both technically competent and emotionally engaging. His capacity to create compelling narratives, memorable characters, and entertaining performances suggests someone who could succeed in creative industries if he could channel these abilities constructively rather than using them primarily for manipulation and self-aggrandizement. The business acumen that emerges in many of Cartman's schemes reveals entrepreneurial instincts that could translate into legitimate success. His ability to identify market opportunities, develop business models, and organize operations demonstrates understanding of economic principles that many adults never master. Some of his ventures have shown genuine commercial potential before being derailed by his inability to maintain ethical standards or collaborative relationships. This suggests that under different circumstances, he might have developed into a successful businessperson capable of creating value for others while achieving his own financial goals. The curse aspect of these talents becomes evident when examining how they consistently serve his worst impulses rather than his best interests. His creativity enables increasingly elaborate deceptions that eventually collapse and damage his relationships. His intelligence allows him to rationalize harmful behavior and avoid responsibility for consequences. His leadership abilities are used to organize others in destructive activities rather than constructive projects. His artistic talents become vehicles for expressing and reinforcing his worst psychological patterns, rather than exploring healthier forms of self-expression. The misdirection of his abilities also prevents their proper development through legitimate channels. Normal talent development requires practice, feedback, mentorship, and gradual skill building within supportive environments. Cartman's use of his abilities for manipulation and deception means he never receives the kind of constructive feedback and guidance that could help him refine these skills and learn to apply them ethically. Instead, he develops increasingly sophisticated techniques for harmful behavior, while his capacity for constructive application atrophies from disuse. The psychological dynamics that drive this misdirection of talent stem from his fundamental inability to find satisfaction through conventional achievement. Because legitimate success requires sustained effort, collaboration with others, and acceptance of feedback and authority, Cartman's psychological framework makes traditional paths to achievement feel impossible or threatening. His talents become escape routes from the normal developmental processes that might actually provide lasting satisfaction and success. The social consequences of his misdirected abilities create additional barriers to constructive application. As his reputation for manipulation and unreliability spreads, fewer people are willing to collaborate with him on legitimate projects or provide the mentorship and opportunities that could help redirect his talents. His past misuse of his abilities creates skepticism about his motives that makes it increasingly difficult for him to access constructive channels for his creativity and intelligence. The economic waste represented by this pattern extends beyond just Cartman's personal loss to include the potential contributions he might have made to society. Genuine creativity and intelligence are valuable resources that benefit entire communities when properly applied. The energy and innovation that Cartman devotes to destructive schemes could have been channeled into businesses, art, or social projects that created value for others while providing him with legitimate success and satisfaction. Perhaps most tragically, the misdirection of his talents reinforces his worst psychological patterns while depriving him of experiences that might promote growth and healing. Legitimate achievement requires developing patience, humility, cooperation, and ethical behavior, precisely the qualities that Cartman most needs to develop. By using his abilities to avoid these growth opportunities, he ensures that his talents become increasingly sophisticated tools for maintaining his dysfunctional patterns rather than vehicles for positive change. The ultimate tragedy is that Cartman's talents could have been his salvation if circumstances had been different. The same creativity, intelligence, and leadership ability that now serve as worst impulses might have provided paths to genuine achievement, healthy relationships, and authentic self-esteem. Instead, these gifts have become curses that enable his dysfunction while preventing the very development that might have led to happiness and success, creating a person whose greatest strengths have become the primary obstacles to everything he claims to want most. The physical and psychological toll that Eric Cartman's lifestyle and emotional dysfunction exact on his body represents a perfect example of how the mind and body are inextricably connected. With his chronic stress, poor emotional regulation, and destructive behavioral patterns manifesting in increasingly serious health problems that both result from and contribute to his broader life difficulties. His body has become a battleground where his psychological conflicts play out through eating disorders, stress-related illness, and physical symptoms that serve as constant reminders of his internal turmoil, while simultaneously making his other problems more difficult to address. The most obvious manifestation of Cartman's psychological distress appears in his relationship with food and eating, which has evolved far beyond simple overindulgence into a complex coping mechanism that both soothes and punishes him simultaneously. His eating patterns reflect his broader relationship with impulse control, emotional regulation, and self-care, with food serving as both comfort during emotional distress and a weapon of self-destruction during periods of shame and self-loathing. The compulsive nature of his eating suggests someone using food to fill emotional voids that cannot be satisfied through consumption, creating cycles where eating provides temporary relief followed by increased shame and physical discomfort. The stress of maintaining his elaborate psychological defenses and social manipulations creates chronic activation of his body's stress response systems, flooding his system with hormones and chemicals designed for brief emergency situations, but devastating when maintained long-term. The constant vigilance required to maintain his false persona, manage his lies and schemes, and defend against perceived threats keeps his nervous system in a perpetual state of high alert that prevents proper rest, digestion, and healing. This chronic stress manifests in sleep disturbances, digestive problems, and compromised immune function that make him more vulnerable to illness while reducing his capacity to cope with additional stressors. His anger management problems create additional physical stress through the explosive emotional reactions that characterize his responses to frustration, criticism, or perceived slights. These rage episodes aren't just psychologically damaging. They create intense physical stress that elevates blood pressure, strains the cardiovascular system, and floods his body with stress hormones that have cumulative negative effects over time. The frequency and intensity of these episodes suggest someone whose emotional regulation system is so compromised that normal frustrations trigger physiological responses appropriate for life-threatening emergencies. The sleep disturbances that result from his psychological turmoil create cascading health problems that affect every aspect of his physical and mental functioning. Chronic sleep deprivation impairs cognitive function, emotional regulation, immune response, and physical coordination while contributing to weight gain, mood disorders, and reduced stress tolerance. For someone already struggling with psychological and social difficulties, the additional burden of sleep-related health problems creates a vicious cycle where poor sleep worsens his behavioral problems, which increases his stress, which further disrupts his sleep patterns. His sedentary lifestyle and avoidance of physical activity represent another dimension of how his psychological problems manifest in physical deterioration. Exercise typically serves as a natural stress reliever, mood stabilizer, and confidence builder, but Cartman's psychological framework makes physical activity feel threatening rather than beneficial. His grandiose self-image conflicts with the temporary discomfort and gradual improvement that exercise requires, while his all-or-nothing thinking makes moderate activity feel pointless. This avoidance deprives him of one of the most effective natural treatments for anxiety, depression, and stress, while contributing to physical deterioration that makes his other problems more difficult to manage. The social isolation that characterizes much of Cartman's existence creates additional health risks through the well-documented connections between loneliness and physical illness. Chronic social isolation has been shown to have health effects comparable to smoking or obesity, affecting immune function, cardiovascular health, and life expectancy. For someone already dealing with multiple physical and psychological stressors, the additional burden of isolation-related health problems creates another layer of difficulty while depriving him of the social support that might help him address his other health issues. His poor impulse control and self-care habits extend beyond eating into broader patterns of neglecting his physical health and engaging in risky behaviors. Whether through poor hygiene, avoiding medical care, or engaging in dangerous schemes, Cartman consistently prioritizes short-term gratification over long-term health considerations. This pattern reflects his broader inability to delay gratification or consider future consequences, but the cumulative effect creates health problems that become increasingly difficult and expensive to address over time. The shame and body image issues that result from his deteriorating physical condition create additional psychological stress that worsens his existing mental health problems. As his physical health declines, his self-esteem suffers further damage, creating more anxiety and depression that drive additional unhealthy coping behaviors. This creates a downward spiral where physical problems worsen psychological problems, which lead to behaviors that worsen physical problems, trapping him in cycles of deterioration that become increasingly difficult to break. The financial implications of his health problems add another layer of stress to his already difficult circumstances. Poor health creates medical expenses, reduces earning capacity, and limits opportunities for improvement, creating additional financial pressure that worsens his economic anxiety while making it more difficult to access the resources that might help address his health issues. For someone already struggling with financial insecurity, health-related expenses can create overwhelming stress that worsens both physical and psychological problems. Perhaps most tragically, many of Cartman's health problems could be significantly improved through lifestyle changes and stress reduction techniques that his psychological framework makes virtually impossible to implement. Proper diet, regular exercise, adequate sleep, stress management, and social connection could address many of his physical symptoms while also improving his mental health and social functioning. However, His need for immediate gratification, his resistance to authority and structure, and his inability to tolerate temporary discomfort make these healthy changes feel psychologically impossible. The long-term trajectory suggested by these health patterns points toward increasing disability, reduced quality of life, and potential early mortality that could be largely preventable with appropriate intervention. His body is keeping score of decades of psychological stress and poor self-care, creating health problems that will become increasingly difficult and expensive to manage as he ages. The cruel irony is that addressing these health issues would require exactly the kinds of sustained effort, professional guidance, and lifestyle changes that his psychological problems make most difficult to accept and maintain. Most heartbreakingly, the physical manifestations of his psychological distress serve as constant reminders of his internal suffering while simultaneously making it more difficult to address the underlying issues that created these problems. His body has become both a symptom of his psychological dysfunction and an additional obstacle to healing, creating a complex web of interconnected problems that reinforce each other while becoming increasingly resistant to simple solutions. The tragic trajectory of Eric Cartman's life points toward an adulthood characterized by increasing isolation, economic marginalization, and social dysfunction that will likely worsen with each passing year unless dramatic intervention occurs. Yet his psychological framework makes such intervention virtually impossible to accept or benefit from. As he transitions from childhood into adolescence and eventually adulthood, the protective factors that currently shield him from the full consequences of his behavior will gradually disappear, leaving him to face a world that has far less tolerance for manipulation, grandiosity, and antisocial behavior than his current environment provides. The employment prospects for someone with Cartman's psychological profile appear increasingly grim as he approaches working age. His inability to accept authority, take criticism, or collaborate effectively with others makes him fundamentally unsuited for most traditional employment opportunities. While his intelligence and creativity might theoretically open doors in entrepreneurial or creative fields, his track record of using these abilities for manipulation and short-term schemes rather than sustained productive effort suggests that he will struggle to convert his talents into legitimate income. The modern economy increasingly rewards collaboration, emotional intelligence, and the ability to build trust-based relationships, precisely the skills that Cartman's psychological framework makes impossible to develop. His social isolation will likely become more severe and painful as his peer group matures and develops the adult relationships that provide meaning, support, and connection throughout life. While childhood friendships can sometimes survive difficult behavior patterns through shared history and parental intervention, adult relationships typically require genuine reciprocity, emotional support, and trustworthiness that Cartman has never demonstrated. As his former friends establish careers, romantic relationships, and families, his inability to form authentic connections will leave him increasingly alone while watching others achieve the belonging and significance he desperately seeks. The romantic and family prospect for Cartman appear particularly bleak, given his complete inability to form genuine emotional connections or maintain relationships based on mutual care and respect. His approach to relationships as transactional arrangements, where others exist primarily to meet his needs, makes him fundamentally unsuited for the intimate partnerships that most adults rely on for emotional support and life satisfaction. Even if he manages to enter relationships, his patterns of manipulation, emotional unavailability, and inability to compromise virtually guarantee that these relationships will be brief and destructive for all parties involved. The financial implications of his unemployability and social dysfunction will likely trap him in cycles of poverty and dependence that worsen his psychological problems while limiting his options for improvement. Without stable employment or strong relationships, he will struggle to achieve the financial security that most adults need for independence, health care, and basic stability. His tendency toward get-rich-quick schemes and avoidance of sustained effort suggests he may turn to increasingly desperate and potentially illegal methods of generating income as conventional opportunities become unavailable. His health trajectory points towards serious medical problems that will become increasingly expensive and difficult to manage without adequate insurance, social support, or lifestyle changes. The chronic stress, poor diet, sedentary lifestyle, and emotional dysfunction that currently manifest as relatively minor health issues will likely evolve into serious chronic conditions requiring ongoing medical care. His inability to follow medical advice, maintain healthy routines, or accept help from healthcare providers will make these conditions more severe and harder to treat, creating additional stress and expense that compound his other difficulties. The legal implications of his behavioral patterns suggest potential conflicts with law enforcement and the justice system as the consequences of his actions become more serious in adulthood. Behaviors that might be dismissed as childhood mischief, manipulation, fraud, harassment, or property destruction carry real legal consequences when performed by adults. His inability to accept responsibility for his actions or modify his behavior based on consequences makes it likely that he will escalate his antisocial behaviors until they cross legal boundaries that result in arrest, prosecution, and potential imprisonment. The psychological deterioration that typically accompanies social isolation, economic failure, and chronic stress will likely worsen Cartman's existing mental health problems while making him less capable of seeking or benefiting from help. Depression, anxiety, and potential substance abuse often emerge when people with underlying psychological vulnerabilities face chronic life stressors without adequate support systems. His defensive patterns and resistance to acknowledging problems make it unlikely that he will seek professional help voluntarily, while his behavior patterns make it difficult for others to maintain the relationships that might encourage treatment. The technological and social changes that characterize modern society may create additional challenges for someone with Cartman's particular disabilities. The increasing emphasis on emotional intelligence, collaborative skills, and authentic personal branding in both professional and social contexts will likely make his manipulative and grandiose approaches even less effective than they are currently. Social media and digital communication create permanent records of behavior that make it harder to escape reputation consequences, while also providing new platforms for the kind of attention-seeking and manipulation that characterize his worst impulses. Perhaps most tragically, the very experiences that might provide opportunities for growth and change, failure, consequences, loss, and suffering, are likely to trigger increased defensiveness and antisocial behavior rather than genuine self-reflection and improvement. His psychological framework interprets setbacks as evidence that others are against him rather than as feedback about his own choices, making it likely that each failure will reinforce his worst patterns rather than motivating positive change. The potential for positive intervention becomes increasingly limited as he ages and his patterns become more entrenched. While childhood and adolescence provide natural opportunities for growth and course correction through education, family intervention, and social pressure, adulthood typically offers fewer external motivations for change while making the consequences of dysfunction more severe. His resistance to therapy, medication, or other professional interventions makes it unlikely that he will voluntarily seek the help that might still be effective in addressing his underlying issues. The ultimate tragedy of Cartman's likely future is that it represents an almost entirely preventable waste of human potential. With different early experiences, appropriate intervention, or even random positive influences, his intelligence and creativity might have developed into genuine achievements that provided satisfaction for himself and value for others. Instead, his trajectory points toward a life characterized by increasing misery, isolation, and destruction that serves no constructive purpose while causing ongoing suffering for everyone who comes into contact with him. The boy who might have become a successful entrepreneur, artist, or leader instead faces a future as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of untreated psychological dysfunction and the tragic waste that occurs when genuine human potential is channeled through fundamentally destructive patterns. Looking at Eric Cartman's life through the lens of psychological analysis reveals not simply a collection of character flaws or moral failures, but a comprehensive portrait of human development gone tragically wrong. A cascade of early trauma, defensive adaptations, and environmental failures that have created someone fundamentally disconnected from the experiences that make life meaningful and satisfying. His story serves as a stark reminder that beneath even the most seemingly irredeemable behavior lies a person whose potential for growth and happiness has been systematically undermined by forces largely beyond their control, even as their responses to those forces create increasingly insurmountable obstacles to the very healing they desperately need. The psychological framework that drives Cartman's behavior represents a perfect storm of adaptive responses to impossible circumstances that have become maladaptive patterns, preventing him from accessing the very things he most needs: authentic connection, genuine achievement, and stable self-worth. His grandiosity serves as protection against overwhelming feelings of inadequacy, but prevents him from engaging in the vulnerable learning that could actually build competence. His manipulation tactics evolved as survival strategies in a chaotic family system, but now sabotage the relationships that might provide security and support. His defensive patterns once protected a vulnerable child from psychological annihilation, but now ensure that he remains trapped in cycles of dysfunction that become more entrenched with each repetition. Understanding Cartman's condition as a developmental disorder rather than simple moral failing opens possibilities for compassion without excusing the real harm his behavior causes to others. His actions consistently hurt and alienate the people around him, creating genuine victims who deserve protection and support regardless of the psychological explanations for his behavior. However, recognizing the systematic nature of his dysfunction also reveals how conventional approaches to addressing his problems, punishment, moral lectures, or demands for immediate behavioral change, are likely to fail because they don't address the underlying psychological architecture that drives his choices. The intervention that might actually help someone in Cartman's position would require a comprehensive approach addressing multiple levels of dysfunction simultaneously. Intensive therapy to address underlying trauma and attachment issues, medication to manage potential mood and impulse control disorders, family therapy to address the enabling dynamics that maintain his patterns, and structured behavioral interventions to help him develop the basic life skills he never learned. Most importantly, such intervention would need to be sustained over years rather than months, as the patterns of thought and behavior that characterize his condition developed over his entire lifetime and cannot be quickly unlearned or replaced. However, the tragic irony is that the very psychological defenses that create Cartman's problems also make him virtually impossible to help through conventional therapeutic means. His narcissistic defenses prevent him from acknowledging that he has problems requiring professional intervention. His grandiosity makes it impossible for him to accept the subordinate role that therapy requires, and his manipulative patterns ensure that he will attempt to control or exploit any therapeutic relationship rather than engaging authentically with the process. Even if forced into treatment, his resistance would likely make genuine therapeutic progress impossible unless the intervention specifically addressed his defensive patterns before attempting to work on underlying issues. The social and family systems that surround Cartman also contribute to maintaining his dysfunction in ways that make individual intervention insufficient. His mother's enabling behavior, the community's inconsistent responses to his actions, and the absence of strong positive role models all combine to reinforce his maladaptive patterns while failing to provide the structure and accountability he needs for growth. Meaningful change would require not just individual therapy, but comprehensive intervention addressing all the environmental factors that support his current functioning. The developmental window for easier intervention has likely already passed, as the neuroplasticity and environmental malleability that characterize childhood and early adolescence naturally decrease with age. While change remains possible at any stage of life, the effort required to modify deeply entrenched patterns becomes exponentially greater as those patterns become more automatic and resistant to conscious control. The longer his dysfunction continues, the more challenging intervention becomes, while the consequences of his behavior become more serious and harder to reverse. Yet even the most pessimistic assessment of Cartman's condition must acknowledge that human beings retain the capacity for growth and change throughout their lives, and that even small improvements in his functioning could significantly reduce the suffering he causes both for himself and others. Recovery from severe psychological dysfunction rarely involves complete transformation into psychological health, but rather gradual development of better coping strategies, reduced destructive behavior, and improved capacity for relationships. Even modest progress in areas like impulse control, emotional regulation, or empathy development could meaningfully improve his quality of life while reducing the negative impact he has on those around him. The broader implications of Cartman's story extend beyond individual psychology into questions about how society identifies, understands, and intervenes with children showing early signs of serious developmental problems. His case illustrates how early trauma and family dysfunction can create psychological patterns that become increasingly resistant to intervention over time, suggesting the crucial importance of early identification and treatment of at-risk children. The failure to address his problems during childhood represents not just personal tragedy, but a systemic failure that could potentially be prevented through better understanding of developmental trauma and more comprehensive mental health services for children and families. Perhaps most importantly, Cartman's story serves as a powerful reminder that behind even the most frustrating and destructive behavior lies a human being whose potential for happiness and connection has been systematically undermined by circumstances largely beyond their control. While this understanding cannot excuse the harm he causes or eliminate the need to protect others from his destructive behavior, it does suggest that responses based purely on punishment or moral condemnation are unlikely to produce positive change. Instead, his condition calls for responses that combine appropriate protection of others with genuine commitment to addressing the underlying factors that drive his dysfunction. The ultimate lesson of Eric Cartman's psychological profile may be that prevention through early intervention and comprehensive support for at-risk families represents both the most humane and most effective approach to addressing severe developmental dysfunction. While his current condition may be largely irreversible, understanding how such conditions develop could help society better identify and support other children before their adaptive responses to trauma become the maladaptive patterns that define their entire lives, ensuring that fewer children grow up to become adults whose greatest need is for the very help their condition makes impossible to accept or benefit from. The story of Eric Cartman represents one of the most complex and troubling examples of human potential derailed by psychological dysfunction, environmental failure, and the tragic inability of existing systems to address severe developmental problems before they become entrenched patterns of destruction. His case challenges our fundamental assumptions about personal responsibility, moral judgment, and the possibility of redemption, while forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about how psychological trauma can create individuals who seem almost designed to sabotage their own happiness while causing maximum damage to everyone around them. Understanding his condition requires us to hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously: that he is both victim and perpetrator, that his behavior is both explainable and inexcusable, and that while his dysfunction may be largely beyond his conscious control, the harm he causes to others remains real and serious regardless of its psychological origins. The psychological architecture that drives Cartman's behavior represents a masterclass in how early trauma and inadequate caregiving can create adaptive responses that become increasingly maladaptive as circumstances change. His grandiosity, manipulation, and emotional volatility likely began as survival strategies in a chaotic family system where normal childhood needs for safety, consistency, and appropriate boundaries were never met. These defensive patterns served him well in navigating his dysfunctional home environment, protecting his psychological survival during critical developmental periods when healthier coping strategies were simply not available or safe to employ. However, the very strategies that may have saved him as a young child have now become the primary obstacles to everything he claims to want most: respect, friendship, achievement, and genuine happiness. The enabling environment that surrounds Cartman illustrates how individual dysfunction cannot be understood or addressed in isolation from the family and social systems that maintain problematic patterns. His mother's inability to set appropriate boundaries, the community's inconsistent responses to his behavior, and the absence of strong authority figures who combine care with accountability all contribute to maintaining his dysfunction while failing to provide the structure he desperately needs for growth. These environmental factors don't excuse his choices, but they do explain why conventional approaches to changing his behavior, punishment, lectures, or demands for immediate improvement, consistently fail to produce lasting change. His dysfunction exists within a web of relationships and circumstances that actively reinforce his worst patterns while making healthy alternatives feel psychologically impossible or dangerous. The developmental window for easier intervention highlights one of the most tragic aspects of Cartman's situation. The neuroplasticity and environmental responsiveness that characterize childhood create natural opportunities for course correction that become increasingly limited as problematic patterns become more entrenched over time. Early intervention addressing his trauma history, family dynamics, and emerging behavioral problems might have prevented the escalation into severe personality dysfunction that now characterizes his functioning. However, the very systems designed to identify and help at-risk children, schools, healthcare providers, social services, often lack the resources, training, or authority necessary to address complex cases like his before they become intractable problems requiring far more intensive and expensive interventions. The question of treatability for someone with Cartman's level of dysfunction remains deeply complex and controversial within mental health circles. Traditional therapeutic approaches assume a level of self-awareness, motivation for change, and capacity for genuine relationship that his psychological defenses make virtually impossible. His grandiosity prevents him from acknowledging problems that require professional help. His manipulative patterns ensure that he will attempt to control rather than engage authentically with therapeutic relationships. And his inability to tolerate vulnerability makes the kind of emotional honesty that therapy requires feel psychologically threatening. Yet, emerging approaches that specifically address narcissistic and antisocial patterns suggest that even severe personality dysfunction can sometimes be modified through specialized interventions that work with rather than against defensive patterns while gradually building capacity for more authentic functioning. The broader social implications of cases like Cartman's extend far beyond individual psychology into fundamental questions about how society should respond to individuals who seem almost designed to abuse the tolerance and goodwill that healthy communities require to function. His behavior tests the limits of social cooperation, challenging our commitment to inclusion, second chances, and rehabilitation while threatening the safety and well-being of others who deserve protection from his destructive patterns. This creates difficult ethical dilemmas about how to balance compassion for his obvious suffering with responsibility to protect his victims, how to maintain hope for his potential redemption while acknowledging the realistic likelihood of continued dysfunction, and how to respond with both justice and mercy to someone whose capacity for change remains deeply uncertain. The economic costs of untreated developmental dysfunction like Cartman's represent a massive and largely hidden burden on society through increased healthcare expenses, special education costs, criminal justice involvement, and lost productivity from both the affected individuals and those who must manage the disruption they create. Early intervention and comprehensive family support programs, while expensive, likely represent significant long-term savings compared to the lifetime costs of managing severe personality dysfunction through crisis response and damage control. However, the political and social will to invest in prevention often remains limited until the consequences of inaction become impossible to ignore. Perhaps most importantly, Cartman's story serves as a powerful reminder that human development is far more fragile and complex than our cultural narratives about personal responsibility and individual choice typically acknowledge. The child who might have become a successful entrepreneur, creative artist, or community leader instead became someone whose greatest talents serve primarily to make him more effectively self-destructive. This transformation didn't occur through moral failing or conscious choice, but through the gradual accumulation of trauma, inadequate support, and defensive adaptations that eventually created someone fundamentally disconnected from the experiences that make life meaningful and satisfying. The ultimate tragedy of Eric Cartman's condition may be that it represents an almost entirely preventable waste of human potential that occurred not through single catastrophic events, but through the accumulated failure of multiple systems to provide the basic requirements for healthy development: consistent care, appropriate boundaries, emotional safety, and genuine connection. His story challenges us to do better for the children currently growing up in similar circumstances, to develop more effective early intervention approaches, and to create communities better equipped to identify and support families before dysfunction becomes entrenched. While it may be too late to fundamentally change its trajectory, understanding how such severe dysfunction develops could help prevent other children from following similar paths, ensuring that fewer families experience the tragedy of watching potential transform into pathology through circumstances that, with adequate knowledge and resources, might have been prevented entirely.